There was a time when gold could sit untouched in vaults and temples, admired but unused, while salt decided who lived, who ate, and who ruled. Gold was beautiful. Gold was symbolic. But salt was survival. Empires didn't rise because they had more gold than their rivals. They rose because they could feed armies, preserve food, and keep populations alive through winter, war, and famine. And for most of human history, nothing did that job better than salt. Armies marched for it. States monopolized it. Entire tax systems were built around it. And when access to it became unfair, people didn't just complain, they revolted. All over a white mineral we now spill casually onto tables without thinking twice. If that sounds absurd, that's only because modern abundance has erased how fragile survival used to be. Nothing says civilization quite like forgetting the thing that once held it together. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand why salt was once more valuable than gold, you have to step into a world without refrigerators, without global supply chains, without chemical preservatives, and without the luxury of wasting food. In the ancient and medieval world, food was not a convenience. It was a constant problem. Meat spoiled quickly. Harvests were seasonal. One bad year could mean starvation. One disrupted supply route could mean collapse. Cities were fragile organisms, always one winter away from disaster. Salt solved that problem, not because it tasted good, but because it preserved life. Salt pulled moisture out of food, stopping bacteria from spreading. It allowed meat and fish to be stored for months instead of days. It made it possible to feed armies far from home, to stockpile grain and protein, to support urban populations that didn't farm their own food. In other words, salt wasn't a seasoning. It was infrastructure. Gold could store wealth, salt created it. This distinction matters more than it sounds. Gold is valuable because people agree it is. Salt was valuable because biology demanded it. Human bodies need sodium to survive. Livestock need it. Food systems collapse without it. That made salt none, and once something becomes non-optional, it becomes a source of power. The ancient world understood this instinctively. The Romans built entire roads specifically to transport salt, the most famous being the Via Salaria, stretching from salt works on the Adriatic coast, deep into the Italian interior. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt allowances, a practice that later evolved into monetary wages, leaving a linguistic trace we still use today. Salary didn't begin as abstract compensation. It began as access to survival. Where salt flowed, civilization followed. But salt had one major characteristic that made it especially useful to states. It was geographically constrained. Not every region could produce it easily. Some places had salt mines. Others depended on evaporation from seawater. Many had neither. That meant salt routes were predictable, production sites were limited, and control was possible. And once control is possible, taxation isn't far behind. This is where salt stops being just a resource and starts becoming a political weapon. States quickly realized that if you control salt, you don't need to tax income or land aggressively. You can tax survival itself. People might evade taxes on wealth. They cannot evade the need to eat. Salt was consumed by everyone every day in predictable quantities. It was the perfect taxable commodity, essential, visible, and unavoidable. In China, imperial salt monopolies existed for centuries, beginning as early as the Han Dynasty. The state controlled production and distribution, using salt revenue to fund armies, bureaucracy, and expansion. In Europe, medieval kingdoms imposed strict salt taxes, regulating who could buy it, how much they could buy, and at what price. Smuggling wasn't just illegal. It was treated as a serious crime because it threatened the state's revenue base. This wasn't greed. It was strategy. When survival goods fund the state becomes deeply invested in controlling daily life. Salt wasn't expensive because it was rare. It was expensive because it was regulated. And regulation turned the necessity into leverage. Nowhere was this clearer than in France, where the infamous salt tax known as the Gabelle became one of the most hated institutions in the country. The tax wasn't applied evenly. Some regions paid more than others. Some were forced to buy minimum quantities whether they needed them or not. Punishments for evasion were severe. For rural populations already living close to the edge, salt wasn't just costly, it was humiliating. The tax didn't just drain money, it drained legitimacy. People didn't revolt overnight. They smuggled, they cheated, and slowly, resentment hardened into something more dangerous. Salt didn't cause the French Revolution on its own, but it taught millions of people a powerful lesson. When the state monetizes survival unfairly, loyalty erodes fast. This pattern wasn't unique to Europe. Across Africa, salt was traded across the Sahara in massive caravans, exchanged directly for gold in regions where metal was plentiful. But salt was scarce. In parts of West Africa, salt blocks were literally weighed against coal dust, sometimes at equal value. To modernize that seems backward to people living in hot climates without preservation. It made perfect sense. Gold was useless if your food rotted. Salt-shaped trade routes determined city locations and influenced the rise and fall of empires. Control salt, and you control logistics. Control logistics, and you control power. It didn't glitter. It didn't impress. But it decided outcomes quietly, relentlessly, and without apology. And for centuries, it worked. But like every system built on scarcity, salt's power depended on limits. Geography limited production. Technology limited preservation. And those limits gave states leverage until one day they didn't. Because eventually technology changed the equation. And when it did, salt didn't crash like a bubble. It didn't collapse in a crisis. It simply lost its grip quietly, permanently. And that's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because salt was never unique. It was just the first essential we learned how to control. When salt lost its power, it didn't happen through rebellion or collapse. It happened through technology. Refrigeration, canning, industrial food processing, and modern logistics slowly broke the ancient link between salt and survival. Food no longer needed to be aggressively preserved to last through winter or war. Supply chains expanded. Production scaled. What was once scarce became abundant. What was once essential became invisible. Salt didn't fall from grace. It faded into the background of everyday life. And with that shift, something important happened. Power moved. The states that had once relied on salt taxes quietly replaced them with other forms of revenue. The monopolies dissolved. Smuggling dried up. No one marched in protest when salt became cheap. Because cheap salt meant full stomachs. The most powerful commodity in the ancient world didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it stopped being a bottleneck. That detail matters. Because history doesn't just tell us what was valuable. It tells us why it was valuable and what happens when that reason changes. Salt was never special because it was white or mineral or ancient. Salt mattered because it sat at the intersection of three forces: necessity, control, and invisibility. People didn't think about it until it was missing. States didn't advertise their reliance on it. And when access was restricted, the consequences were immediate and human. Hunger doesn't wait for ideology. That pattern didn't die with salt. It repeated again and again. Today, we no longer organize empires around salt mines or evaporation ponds. But we still organize power around essentials that most people barely notice until they're disrupted. Energy, data, water, shipping routes, semiconductors, payment systems. These are the modern equivalents of salt. Not glamorous, not romantic, but absolutely decisive. No one celebrates electricity when it works. They panic when it doesn't. No one praises logistics when shelves are full. They revolt when they aren't. These systems are designed to fade into the background because their real value is psychological stability. As long as essentials flow smoothly, societies feel normal. When they don't, confidence collapses faster than prices. This is where Salt becomes a lesson in modern finance. Inflation doesn't hurt most when luxury goods rise in price. It hurts when essentials do. When energy costs spike, when food prices rise, when rent absorbs a larger share of income, people don't feel poorer, they feel trapped. The margin for error shrinks. Survival becomes expensive. And once survival is expensive, politics destabilize quickly. This isn't theory. It's pattern recognition. Every major social rupture in history follows pressure on a not because people are irrational, but because biology doesn't negotiate. You can delay buying gold. You cannot delay eating. You can postpone investing. You cannot postpone heating your home. Systems that monetize survival too aggressively don't just extract revenue. They extract legitimacy. So taught states this lesson early. Some learned restraint, others didn't. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The most powerful economic systems are not built around what people admire. They're built around what people depend on. Gold dazzles. Stocks excite. Speculation entertains. But real power hides in boring infrastructure that functions quietly until it doesn't. Salt was boring. That's why it worked. It didn't promise wealth. It promised continuity. And continuity is the foundation of any stable system. Empires understood it when they protected grain routes before minting coins. Modern governments understand it when they prioritize energy security over short-term growth, even if they don't always admit it. Real wealth isn't about accumulation alone. It's about control over essentials without triggering rebellion. It's about managing scarcity without weaponizing it. It's about understanding where leverage exists and where it becomes dangerous. Salt also teaches a quieter lesson about financial freedom. People often think freedom comes from owning more assets. History suggests it comes from reducing dependence on fragile systems. When survival costs are low and predictable, societies stabilize. When they are volatile and manipulated, instability follows. This applies at the state level and the personal level alike. The less of your income goes to survival, the more room you have to adapt, invest, and think long-term. Gold didn't give that freedom. Salt did. And when salt stopped being scarce, power didn't disappear. It simply relocated the energy markets to financial plumbing, to data flows, to the quiet systems most people never see, but everyone relies on. That's why history keeps repeating this pattern. Not because leaders are foolish, but because incentives are relentless. Control essentials and you control behavior. Lose control and legitimacy evaporates. Salt was one of the first commodities to teach humanity this lesson. Clearly, not because it was rare, but because it was necessary. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was unavoidable. And that's the final insight worth holding on to. Value isn't fixed. It's contextual. It changes with technology, geography, and dependence. What matters isn't what shines, it's what sustains. Systems rise around necessities, not luxuries. And they fall when the cost of survival becomes unbearable. Empires didn't rise because they had more gold than their rivals. They rose because they understood what people couldn't live without and built power around it. Salt decided who ate, who marched, who endured. And while we no longer trade it for gold, the logic it reveals still governs the financial system we live inside today. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.